Spring arrived, and the air turned heavy with the scent of dust and iron. The armies of Israel marched out from the city gates, a rhythmic thunder of thousands of feet moving toward the siege of Rabbah. Standards snapped in the wind. The clatter of metal gear echoed against the stone walls as the columns stretched toward the horizon. By midday,
the gates were shut. The sound of the campaign faded into a distant, hollow silence.
Inside the palace walls, the halls were empty. David stood on the high roof, looking out toward the east,
his hands gripping the stone parapet until his knuckles turned white.
He paced the length of the terrace, his shadow long and flickering in the late afternoon sun. He stopped, turned, and paced again. Every room behind him felt too large, every corridor too quiet.
He watched the shadows grow across the courtyard floors,
his eyes scanning the city below with a gaze that found no rest. The war was far away. Here, the heat hung stagnant.
And the king walked in circles, waiting for a purpose that had not yet arrived.
The sun dipped lower, casting long, amber streaks across the palace rooftops. David leaned against the stone, his eyes tracing the distant hills where his men fought. But the view offered no relief. He turned his back to the horizon, his gaze sweeping over the clustered homes below. A flash of movement caught his attention in a garden tucked away from the main thoroughfare. He squinted, shifting his weight to get a clearer angle.
A woman stood near a basin of water. He did not look away. The silence of the palace felt different now.
No longer empty, but charged with a sudden, sharp clarity. He moved to the edge of the parapet, his breath hitching as he watched her. The rest of the city vanished from his vision. There was only the garden and the figure below. He gripped the stone edge again, his fingers digging into the rough surface. His pulse quickened. The restlessness that had plagued his afternoon solidified into a singular, unwavering focus. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the garden, unwilling to break the connection even as the shadows deepened around him. David did not move until the last light of the sun bled from the sky. He signaled to the guards patrolling the terrace,
his voice low and sharp. They approached, bowing their heads,
waiting for his command. He pointed down toward the garden, his fingers steady, his eyes never leaving the spot where she had been. "Find her," he ordered. "Learn who she is." The guards turned and descended the stone stairs, their sandals clicking against the hard masonry. David returned to the parapet, watching the garden now shrouded in twilight. He waited in the cooling air, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw tight. Minutes stretched into an hour before the footsteps returned. The guards emerged from the shadows of the doorway, their faces unreadable in the dim light. They spoke the name clearly, Bathsheba. David stood motionless as they continued. "She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite." The name struck the air like a physical weight. Uriah was a man of the front lines, a soldier currently serving under the king's own banner. David looked back toward the dark garden, the silence of the night now heavy with a new, dangerous knowledge. David did not hesitate. He sent his trusted servants back into the city, their instructions absolute and final.
They moved through the narrow streets under the cover of night, reaching the house where Bathsheba lived.
They delivered the king's summons. She followed them through the palace gates, her footsteps echoing against the cold stone of the inner courtyard. David waited in the high chamber, the air thick with the scent of burning oil and cedar. He did not look at the maps or the scrolls of war. When she entered, he closed the heavy doors, locking the world outside. The conversation was sparse. He had already decided the outcome before she crossed the threshold. They moved into the shadows of the room, the flickering torchlight casting long, distorted shapes against the walls. The act was swift, deliberate, and final. No words of comfort passed between them. In the hour before dawn, he opened the doors again. Bathsheba walked out into the cooling air of the courtyard, her head bowed, returning to the house of her husband. David remained in the chamber, the silence of the palace settling around him once more, but the weight of the night now sat firmly upon his shoulders. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of the palace resumed. David returned to his scrolls and his maps. The memory of that night pushed to the back of his mind. He sat in his council room, listening to reports from the border, when the heavy oak doors groaned open. A messenger entered, his boots caked in red dust from the city streets. He did not wait for an invitation to speak. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the floor, and held out a sealed scroll. David took the parchment, breaking the wax seal with a thumb that trembled only for a fraction of a second. He read the lines twice. The ink was clear. The words were simple, yet they cut through the room like a blade. I am with child. David lowered the scroll to his lap. The sound of the city outside the windows felt suddenly deafening. The secret he had buried was no longer a secret. It was a ticking clock. He looked at the messenger, who remained frozen, waiting for a response that would not come. David stood up, paced to the window, and stared out at the city. The pregnancy was a public scandal in the making, and the husband was still at war. David turned away from the window, his mind already mapping the path of least resistance. He snatched a clean sheet of papyrus and a quill from his desk. His hand moved across the surface with practiced speed. He was not asking for a favor. He was setting a trap. He folded the parchment, pressed his signet ring into the hot wax, and signaled for his captain. The man appeared instantly. David handed him the scroll. "Ride to the front lines," he commanded. "Tell Joab to release Uriah the Hittite immediately. Tell him his presence is required in Jerusalem to report on the progress of the siege." The captain bowed and turned, his boots striking the stone floor with rhythmic urgency. David watched him go, then paced the length of the room, his eyes scanning the maps of the battlefield. He practiced the expressions he would wear when the soldier arrived. He needed to appear as the benevolent king, concerned only for the morale of his troops. He practiced the tone of his voice, shifting it from the cold calculation of a ruler to the casual interest of a man curious about the dust of the war. Outside, the horsemen galloped through the city gates, carrying the king's deception toward the distant encampment. The distance between the palace and the battlefield began to shrink. The heavy gates groaned open, admitting the dust-covered soldier into the palace courtyard. Uriah walked with a steady, measured pace, his presence commanding the space even amidst the opulence of the court. David sat on his throne, his posture relaxed, his face composed into a mask of regal concern.
He beckoned the soldier forward. "Tell me," David began, his voice smooth and devoid of tension.
"How does Joab fare? Are the men holding their lines against the city walls?" Uriah stood rigid, his gaze fixed forward as he recounted the shifting movements of the siege. David nodded at every detail, feigning deep interest while his eyes searched the soldier for signs of fatigue. When the report concluded, David stood up and waved a hand dismissively. "You have traveled far and served well. Go home. Wash your feet, find your rest, and spend the evening with your wife." He signaled to his servants, who immediately brought forth a tray of choice meats and wine. "A gift from the king," David added, watching as the servants followed the soldier toward the exit. He waited, his breath held, listening for the sound of Uriah departing the palace grounds entirely. David stood by the arched window, watching the courtyard below. He expected to see the soldier leave, to see him head toward the city streets and his own home. Minutes stretched into an hour. The courtyard remained occupied, but the soldier did not emerge. David felt a tightening in his chest. He descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing against the cold stone, and moved toward the outer palace gates. The night air was sharp, biting at his skin. He reached the threshold where the servants rested on straw mats. There, huddled against the wall, lay the soldier. He had not gone home. He had not touched the wine. He had rolled himself into a position on the hard ground, his hand resting near his side, eyes closed in deep, rhythmic sleep. The king stopped, his shadow falling across the man. The soldiers nearby shifted, sensing his presence. But the man remained motionless, anchored to the gate by a duty that David had not anticipated. The king stood in the dark, watching the soldier breathe. The deception had stalled. The soldier remained at his post, blocking the path of David's plan, turning the palace gate into a barrier of unexpected integrity. The morning sun cut through the courtyard, hitting the stone floor with harsh intensity.
David stood over the sleeping figure, his jaw tight. He kicked the dirt near the soldier's boot. "Wake up!"
he commanded. Uriah stirred, his eyes snapping open with immediate clarity. He rose in one fluid motion, standing straight despite the night spent on cold stone. David leaned in,
his voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Why are you still here? You had a journey. You had a home. Why did you not go to your wife after all this time?" Uriah did not look down.
His gaze met the king's without a flicker of hesitation. The Ark of the Covenant, Israel, and Judah remain intense, Uriah stated, his voice steady and echoing in the quiet courtyard. "My commander Joab and his men are camping in the open fields. I have heard them suffer. Shall I go to my house to eat, drink, and lie with my wife while they face the blade? I will not do this thing." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. David stared at him, his face unreadable.
Seeing the wall of integrity that stood between him and his desire, the king turned away, his hands clenching at his sides.
David kept him in the palace for another day. He organized a feast, the tables heavy with roasted meat and bowls of fruit. He sat across from the soldier, pouring wine into a silver cup until it brimmed. "Drink," David commanded. Uriah took the cup. He drank, his throat working against the liquid. David watched, his own hands restless, pouring again the moment the cup emptied. The feast stretched long into the evening. The air grew thick with the smell of scorched fat and fermented grapes. Uriah's movements slowed. His head began to dip,
his eyes losing their sharp, focused edge. David leaned forward, his voice a low, encouraging murmur. "David!"
Pushing the wine forward as if it were a weapon, he saw the soldier stumble when he finally stood to leave. He saw the sway in his gait, the way his heavy boots dragged against the floor tiles. The king held his breath, waiting for the soldier to turn toward the city gates that led to his home. Instead, Uriah moved with a heavy, stumbling gravity back toward the outer entrance. He found the familiar stone floor near the servants. He sat, leaned his back against the cold masonry, and let his head drop. The wine had dulled his senses, but not his resolve. He fell into a deep, jagged sleep right there, blocking the exit once again. The sun rose again, casting long, sharp shadows across the courtyard. David watched from the upper balcony. Below, Uriah remained curled against the stone wall, his breathing deep and steady, despite the previous night. The soldier did not stir toward his home. He did not seek his wife. He stayed at the gate, a silent, immovable obstruction to the king's peace.
David gripped the wooden railing until his knuckles turned white. He had poured the wine. He had offered the feast. He had used every lever of his power, yet the man remained anchored to his duty. The king's face darkened,
the lines around his mouth tightening into a rigid, bloodless mask. He stopped pacing. The aimless energy evaporated, replaced by a singular, focused stillness. He looked down one final time at the sleeping man, his eyes devoid of any lingering doubt. The solution was no longer in persuasion. It was no longer in the cup. David turned away from the balcony, his footsteps heavy and purposeful as he walked back into the dim interior of his chambers. He reached for parchment and a seal, his movements precise and cold. The trap had failed, but the path was now clear. David sat at his desk, the ink staining his fingers as he pressed the quill into the parchment. His hand moved with steady, mechanical precision. He finished the final line, blew on the wet ink, and folded the paper tightly. He reached for a stick of wax, held it over a candle flame until it dripped, and pressed his signet ring into the soft, cooling pool. The seal was complete. He stood and signaled to the guard waiting by the door. "Bring him," David ordered. A moment later, Uriah stood before the desk, his presence still bearing the dust of the front lines. He looked at the king with an expectant, steady gaze. David held out the scroll. His fingers did not tremble as he pressed the heavy, sealed document into the soldier's hand. "Take this to Joab," David said, his voice level and devoid of inflection. Uriah took the parchment, tucked it securely into his belt, and gave a sharp, disciplined nod. He turned on his heel and walked toward the gates. David watched him go, his eyes tracking the man until he vanished into the morning light. The soldier stepped out onto the road, unaware that the weight against his side was the instrument of his own end. The road back to the front lines was long and turned increasingly barren. Uriah traveled with the steady rhythm of a man who knew the path by heart. The scroll remained tucked firmly against his side, a constant,
solid weight that shifted with every stride of his horse. As he neared the encampment,
the silence of the countryside gave way to the low, rhythmic thud of siege engines. The air grew thick with the scent of wood smoke and turned earth. He passed the perimeter guards, his eyes scanning the familiar rows of tents that stretched toward the horizon. The camp was a hive of controlled, frantic activity.
Soldiers moved between the supply lines, their faces grim and stained with dust. Uriah did not stop to rest or trade news.
He navigated the chaotic maze of the camp with direct purpose, his hand occasionally brushing the hidden seal at his belt. He reached the command sector, where the tension was palpable, a sharp contrast to the distant, quiet palace he had just left. He dismounted, tied his horse to a wooden stake, and walked toward the center of the camp. The command tent stood ahead, the flap fluttering in the hot, dry breeze.
He took a breath, adjusted his grip on the scroll, and stepped forward to deliver the king's order.
Joab took the scroll, his thumb sliding under the wax seal with a sharp crack. He unfolded the parchment,
his eyes scanning the lines of ink in silence. He did not look at Uriah. He did not ask about the king.
He simply refolded the letter, tucked it into his pouch, and turned toward the map spread across the table. With a calloused finger, he traced the line of the city walls, pointing toward the western gate where the stone was weakest and the fighting was constant. He looked up at his officers,
his expression hard and unreadable. "Move the vanguard," Joab ordered, his voice cutting through the tent like a blade. "Shift the line to the western perimeter. Place the men at the base of the gate where the pressure is highest."
He turned his gaze toward Uriah. "You are to lead the advance at that position." Uriah nodded, his loyalty absolute, and turned to follow the command. He walked out of the tent and toward the wall, his boots crunching on the dry, broken ground. The camp hummed with the sound of steel shifting and men repositioning.
Joab watched him walk away, his eyes cold, as he tracked the soldier to the killing zone.
The trap was set, the lines were drawn, and the space between the walls was already marked for blood. The heavy iron hinges of the gate groaned, a sound that cut through the tension of the waiting infantry.
Without warning, the barrier swung outward. A wave of enemy soldiers surged into the field, their momentum crashing into the front line. The impact sent a shudder through the ranks of the defenders.
From high above, the defenders on the wall responded instantly.
The bowstrings snapped in a rhythmic, deadly chorus. A rain of feathered shafts darkened the air, hissing as they descended. The ground became a churn of motion and panic.
Men tripped over uneven earth as the arrows found their marks, thudding into wood and flesh.
The air grew thick with the sound of clashing steel and shouted commands that were lost in the roar of the assault.
Soldiers scrambled to find cover.
But the open field offered no sanctuary from the barrage raining down from the ramparts. Every step forward was met with a new volley.
Dust kicked up by the melee blurred the lines of the fight, turning the space before the wall into a suffocating,
blood-soaked haze where sight was limited to the reach of a blade.
A signal horn blasted, low and mournful. The soldiers to the left and right of Uriah turned, their boots churning the dirt as they retreated in a practiced, fluid motion. Uriah gripped his shield, stepping forward, expecting the formation to hold. He glanced back. The space behind him was empty. The line had vanished. He stood alone in the center of the field,
a solitary target framed against the looming stone wall. High above, the archers did not hesitate. They adjusted their aim,
the wood of their bows creaking under the tension of the pull. The air hummed. A single shaft caught the sunlight before it buried itself in his side. Uriah stumbled, the force spinning him around. He reached for the shaft, his fingers slick with heat. Another arrow struck his shoulder, then a third caught his chest. He gasped, the sound lost in the din of the ongoing battle. His knees hit the ground, the impact jarring his frame. He leaned forward, bracing his weight on his palms, but his strength failed. He collapsed into the dust, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, as the sounds of the conflict washed over him and finally faded into silence. The messenger spurred his horse, the animal's flanks heaving as it tore across the dry plains. He did not look back at the wall. He did not look at the fallen men left behind in the churned earth. His focus remained fixed on the road to Jerusalem. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the rhythmic thud of hooves and the thickening heat of the afternoon. He reached the palace gates as the sun began its descent. He dismounted, his legs trembling from the long ride, and pushed past the guards into the inner courtyard. The stone floor was cool against his boots. He found David waiting, his posture rigid. The messenger stopped, his chest rising and falling in sharp, ragged breaths. He wiped a smear of grime from his forehead. "The enemy soldiers came out of the gate against us," he reported, his voice raspy from the wind. "We fought them back to the entrance, but they retreated inside. The archers fired from the wall, and several of our men were struck down."
"Among the dead, my lord, is Uriah the Hittite." The messenger lowered his head,
waiting for the king's response, the silence in the chamber heavy with the weight of the name. David stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. He did not turn, he did not blink. The messenger remained bowed, his breath hitching in the quiet room. David finally shifted his weight, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned to face the man, his expression a mask of indifference. "Tell Joab this," David said, his voice steady and devoid of tremors. "Do not let this matter discourage you. The sword devours one as well as another. Strengthen the attack against the city and overthrow it." He waved a hand, a dismissive gesture that signaled the end of the audience. The messenger hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the king for a sign of grief, but finding only stone, he bowed low and backed out of the chamber. David watched him go, then walked to the table. He poured a cup of water, his hand perfectly still. He drank, set the cup down with a sharp click against the wood, and looked back toward the garden. The room felt empty, save for the weight of the order he had just delivered. He paced the length of the floor, his boots striking the stone in a rhythmic, hollow sound.
The news of the slaughter at the wall reached her before the sun set. Bathsheba remained in her home, the doors bolted against the outside world. She sat on the floor, the stone hard beneath her,
and listened to the city sounds fade into the night. Days followed in a singular, repetitive pattern.
She moved from the hearth to the window, the firelight casting long shadows against the bare walls.
She did not speak. She did not receive visitors. The morning rites were observed with rigid,
physical precision. The ashes, the silence, the slow passage of hours marked by the tolling of temple bells.
When the final day of the required period passed, she rose and washed her face. There was a knock at the door, not of a friend, but of palace guards. She opened the heavy timber. They did not speak, only gestured toward the road leading to the high palace. She walked ahead of them, her pace steady. The palace gates swung open, revealing the courtyard where David stood waiting. He stepped forward, as she crossed the threshold. The transition was absolute. She entered the inner chambers, the household staff bowing as she passed, and the life she had known ended in the quiet closing of the heavy doors. The union was finalized within the inner sanctum. No music played, no crowds gathered to offer cheers.
The servants moved through the corridors with their eyes lowered, their footsteps muffled by thick rugs. David sat at his desk,
his fingers tracing the edge of a scroll, but his mind did not settle. He rose and walked to the terrace overlooking the city. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted fingers of darkness across the rooftops.
He gripped the stone railing until his knuckles turned white. Inside the chamber, the air felt stagnant,
thick with the scent of unlit incense. Bathsheba remained in the adjacent room, her presence felt but unseen.
A silent weight behind the heavy oak doors. David looked up at the darkening sky, expecting the familiar comfort of the night, but found only a profound, unnatural stillness. The city below seemed to hold its breath. Every shadow in the palace seemed to stretch, deepening into corners where the torchlight could not reach. The transaction was complete, the power secured, yet the walls of the palace seemed to vibrate with a low, persistent tension. It was not a sound,
but a presence, a cold, unyielding pressure that sat upon the stone floors and hung in the rafters. The deed was done,
buried beneath layers of law and custom, yet it remained, a dark, immovable shadow cast long and deep before the Lord.